So welcome to Climate Solutions 101. We're going to get started to think about how we're going to address climate change and how we're going to solve one of the world's biggest problems. We want to set the stage and understand how this moment in human history, this moment of climate change and climate solutions, started in the first place. When we think about human history, we have to go back a long, long time. It turns out our ancient ancestors started walking this planet about 6 million years ago. And during all that time, early humans and our ancestors started to affect the environment. But they did it very locally, just right around where they lived. But something really changed in the last century, especially the last 50 years or so. We began to change the entire planet, all at once, in several different ways. Well, one of the things that happened, of course, is there are a lot more people on the planet. We're now over 7.5 billion people walking the Earth today and climbing. We also, for the first time in history, became an urban species. Over half the people on Earth now live in a city. That's never happened before. We also formed a global economy that is powered by technology and international trade and has been growing faster than ever. In fact, if you look at the last 50 years, we see about a doubling of global population. The economy globally grew between 5 and 6-fold. So think about that, twice as many people doing almost 6 times more stuff. We then use about 3 times more food, twice as much water, and 3 times more fossil fuels than we did back in 1970. In the last 50 years, we have changed more than the previous 6 million years. In a way, it's kind of an inflection point. It's when everything's changing. Even the way we're changing is changing right now. And unfortunately, this change in us is also changing the planet in ways that are incredibly disruptive. Some of these changes you can see by just looking out the window. They're obvious. They're really right in front of you. For example, when we cut down a forest, we go in with chainsaws and bulldozers and set things on fire. You obviously can see that. And we're doing a lot of it. If we look at the Earth from outer space, we can see forest with a satellite. Here's a picture of a pretty remote part of the Amazon in Bolivia in the 1970s. And if you look carefully, there's a little dirt road running right through the middle of that forest. The very first clearings, just starting in 1975. But if we go back here about 25 years later, the whole area has been radically transformed into soybean fields. And those soybeans are being shipped all the way to China to be used as animal feed. So a global economy connecting the Amazon to Chinese pigs is clearing rainforest in a remote part of the world. And this is happening everywhere. In fact, we're seeing so far about 30% of all the tropical forests on Earth have been lost, and a lot of that in the last few decades. We also see how agriculture, just farming, is changing the world. We usually think of farming on a small scale, like an individual farmer's field. We can walk through it, we can pull up a carrot, we can look at the cows and all this kind of thing. But agriculture is now a global force. Again, if we look at it from satellite, the Earth is covered in agriculture. This map shows in green the areas where we grow our crops. That includes the plants we eat, of course, but also the plants we feed to animals, and some we feed to cars in the form of biofuels. The brown areas are where we actually raise the remaining animals, our pastures and rangelands. And if you put it all together, agriculture now covers over a third, between 35 and 40%, of all the land on the planet. It is now the largest ecosystem on Earth, and that's incredible. So we've changed forests, we've changed the world through agriculture, and we're also changing the nature of water across the planet. We're a pretty thirsty species. We use a lot of water on this planet for our homes, to drink, and we use water in industry. And we use most of our water, though, in agriculture. About 70% of the water we take out of nature is used for just one thing, irrigation. Let me show you how that can affect the world, though. Here's a picture of the Aral Sea from the late 1960s. This is a satellite picture showing one of the world's largest inland bodies of water in the middle of Central Asia in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. But the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s diverted the rivers that would feed the Aral Sea. Instead, they sent that water over into the deserts of Kazakhstan to grow cotton in the middle of the desert. And this is what happened. It shut off the water supply of one of the world's great inland seas, and it disappeared. And this is not just unique to Central Asia. This kind of overuse of water resources is happening in California. It's happening in the Midwest, in the Great Plains, in our Ogallala Aquifer. It happens in North Africa. It happens in Australia. It happens in China and everywhere. In fact, our thirst for water has massively disrupted water resources and ecosystems across the globe. So these changes we've seen in like forest and land and water, they're just plain as day. We can see them, we can photograph them, they're right in front of us. But some other changes happening to the planet were initially a little bit more subtle, especially changes to our atmosphere and to the climate of our planet. This story actually begins more or less in the 1800s. Starting back then, we began activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels and the explosion of agriculture, that started to change the nature of our atmosphere. For example, we saw that CO2 levels, one of the major so-called greenhouse gases, started to increase from the 1800s till about now. And it's so far increased by about 50%. And today, greenhouse gas levels are higher than they've been for 3 to 5 million years. We've never seen something like this in any time in human existence. And later I'll talk about this, how greenhouse gases going up causes the temperature of the planet to go up. And while the greenhouse gases like CO2 have risen, so have the temperatures of our planet. In fact, the temperature of our planet is warmed by about 1 degree Celsius already. Initially, that was a little subtle. Maybe it was a half a degree or 0.6 of a degree and so on. And we could argue whether this was happening or not. But today, it is plain as day that we have changed the temperature of our planet, and it's getting warmer faster all the time. We're seeing the effects of a warmer planet almost everywhere we look. One of the early signs was looking at our glaciers. Here in Alaska, we have the Muir Glacier, which now has to be relabeled Muir Lake. We also see in South America, on the other side of the world, how glaciers in Patagonia and South America are melting, forming large lakes as well. Perhaps most disturbingly, though, is changes to an entire ocean. We're seeing how the Arctic Ocean, which is usually covered in sea ice year-round, has been melting year by year by year. Here in the 1980s, we see when sea ice is at its kind of minimum in late summer, early fall. But by the early 2010s, we see a massive reduction in sea ice, which continues to this day. And soon, maybe within a decade or so, we'll have the first ice-free Arctic months in all of recent geologic time. And we're seeing a planet radically transformed by our actions. And again, this all became possible in the last 50 years or so. Scientists often call this period of time the Great Acceleration, when everything started to take off. We see population change, urbanization, globalization, and then we started clearing ecosystems like forest, and we built up more and more farms around the world. We started building huge dams and using more and more water than ever before. We also use more fertilizers and more chemicals, especially in agriculture and industry. And those change the nature of water, even at the scale of our oceans. And then, of course, we're farming the oceans. We're harvesting more fish than ever and doing what we call aquaculture, or fish farms, on a scale unlike anything we've ever seen. But the really scary big thing that's happening, of course, is climate change. Our use of energy, our clearing of land, and a few other things have changed the nature of the entire atmosphere forever. And those changes are going to make the planet warmer. And if we keep going, it's going to be a massive disruption to everything on the planet. Not just the thermometers, not just the polar bears, but us. In fact, climate change has the potential to hurt the most vulnerable people among us. People living right on the edge of poverty or food security or having fresh water or good, safe places to live. Climate change is going to put a huge burden on future generations. People who didn't emit anything, they're not even born yet. And yet we could be leaving a giant mess on their doorstep that could last for centuries or thousands of years. Now, I wouldn't blame you one bit if you took all of this information in and said, this looks really grim, and maybe it's even hopeless. I'm going to stop you right there, because it's not true. It is not hopeless at all. In fact, there are a lot of things that are getting better. At the same time, the environmental situation is getting worse. Let me remind you of a few of these. During the last 50 years, for example, humans have gotten healthier. We used to live to be about 55 years on average on this planet, just back in the 1970s. Today, the average person on Earth can be expecting to live to be over 70, 71. That's amazing. We also see that women have many fewer children. 50 years ago, the average woman on Earth had over 5 children, on average. Today, it's 2.4 and falling faster than anybody ever predicted. And those children are healthier, with stronger families, and women have more opportunities than they've had before. We also see the world is far more literate than it's ever been. Today, 86% of the world's population can read and write. Back in 1970, that was only 50%. Back in 1900, it was only 15%. And at that point is the highest in all of history. We are healthier, we have more rights, and we're more educated and literate than anybody who's ever lived before. We're also more urban, we're more mobile, we're more connected and less violent than any people who've ever walked before us. So this is an interesting paradox, isn't it? Some things are getting better, some things are really getting worse. A lot of people come up to me and ask, like, well, so what's the future going to be? Is it going to be a total disaster, kind of like a Mad Max movie, some dystopian science fiction disaster film? Or is it going to be awesome? Is it going to be like a Star Trek movie where we pull ourselves out of this mess and build an incredible future and seize this amazing opportunity we have to become better? Which one's it going to be? Well, the answer is up to you. Up to us. It's up to everybody. We get to build the future we want. It hasn't happened yet. We don't know what tomorrow is going to be because we haven't built tomorrow yet. The future is ours to choose, so we have to choose a good one. And we can choose a world if we want to. If we really put our minds to it, we still have the ability to build a future where people and nature can thrive today and tomorrow. But to get there, we're going to have to do the hardest thing of all. We're going to have to step back as a people and make our choice, to make the choice of a generation, of this moment in history. We have to choose between the people we are or the people we can be. The people like some of our ancestors who gave everything so that we could live better lives. We are capable of so much, and yet we've realized so little. What do we choose? And we could choose the world that is. That's a giant mess right now in a lot of ways. Or we could choose the world that could be, an incredible world full of potential when we seize all of our creativity and energy to build the world that we want. So which one are you going to choose? Which one are we all going to choose? The future of the world and everyone who will live after us will depend on that decision. Okay, so now we're going to look at how we can stop climate change, achieve what we call drawdown. Stopping climate change is necessary if we want to have a better future, because everything we do is connected back to climate change. Our water, our food, our air, our health, our security, our economy are all connected to what happens to weather and climate. So if we don't fix climate change, all the other things we care about in the future are going to be a lot harder. So we need to address climate change in order to have a better future with a prosperous economy, with resilience, equity, justice, and creativity. All the things we want demand that we address climate change. And that's what we're about. I work for something called Project Drawdown, which is the world's leading resource for climate solutions. We focus on the science we need to know to address climate change and then share it with the world. Why do we use that word drawdown? What does that even mean? Well, drawdown refers to a point in time in the future, and it refers to the greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere. Now, I remember I told you in the last unit, greenhouse gases have been building up in the atmosphere. Here we are today at the 2020 levels. But then we can choose what happens next. On the path we're on now, we'll just continue to build up these gases, which will just warm the planet more, making the problem worse. But we don't have to do that. We can bend the curve. Bending the curve on climate change means reversing the curve of growing greenhouse gases. And when we hit this point, the little blue dot here, that's the moment of drawdown. That's the moment when greenhouse gases stop climbing and they begin to go back down again into a healthier place. So drawdown is the moment in the future when greenhouse gas levels stabilize and stop climbing, and then they start to steadily decline. And that's when we begin to stop climate change. At Project Drawdown, our job is to get the world to drawdown as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. So how do we get there? Well, first, we're going to have to learn a little bit of science. It won't be too hard, but it's the stuff we really do need to know to kind of get forward on climate solutions. So first of all, what are greenhouse gases? Well, you've heard a little bit about this before, I'm sure. You know that greenhouse gases kind of let in the sun's heat and they trap the Earth's heat as Earth is radiating out into outer space. So essentially they trap heat. And the more gases means the more heat. And that's why the planet's warming up. Pretty simple. But there's a little bit more to it. It turns out that Earth already had greenhouse gases before we came along. There were natural greenhouse gases like water vapor, a little bit of carbon dioxide, and a few other things that have been there for millions, if not billions, of years of Earth history. But then we've got these things we call anthropogenic greenhouse gases, or human-caused greenhouse gases that we've been adding on top of that. And those include more carbon dioxide than was there before, more methane, more nitrous oxide. We've added chemicals that weren't even in the atmosphere before, like fluorinated gases, so-called chlorofluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, and so on, and many other gases that are impacting our climate. And we can actually see how they've been rising over the last 100, 200 years. And especially in the last few decades, we have changed the nature of Earth's atmosphere and added a human greenhouse effect on top of natural greenhouse effect. And that's where we're getting into trouble. So what do these do? It's actually really simple physics. The idea is greenhouse gases are transparent. They let solar radiation, visible light, what we can see, right through them, like just a window. You can see right through it. But in infrared radiation, which you and I can't see, it is opaque. The infrared radiation is what Earth gives off to the rest of the universe, and so it can trap that heat in the atmosphere. It kind of works like this. Imagine a version of Earth with no atmosphere at all, like the moon. It would absorb the sun's radiation and warm up. The sun's heating the ground, and the ground would warm up. The ground, just obeying the laws of physics, would also give off heat or infrared radiation back to the rest of the universe, out to outer space. And without an atmosphere, this is what it would look like. The sun's heat comes in, Earth heat goes out, and they'd be in perfect balance, and we'd be at a temperature that would be accordingly in balance with that. But now let's add an atmosphere, a natural atmosphere. So we have what was the natural greenhouse effect. The idea is as Earth is radiating its heat out into outer space, some of it would be absorbed by the air above it, and some of that would then be re-radiated back down towards the Earth's surface. That has the effect of making the Earth's surface a little bit warmer and the upper atmosphere a little bit colder. And that's exactly what Earth has had, and so are mainly all the other planets. Venus, Mars, and others also have a greenhouse effect kind of like that. But then humans come along and we add some more of those gases to the atmosphere. It'd be like adding another blanket on your bed in the wintertime. It traps more heat and keeps you toastier, a little bit warmer, and so on. So this enhanced greenhouse effect traps a little bit more heat, radiates a little bit more down, and it warms the surface even more. And so far, we've warmed the planet about 1 degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like a lot, but think about it. During the last ice age, the planet as a whole was only 3 degrees colder than normal, and it was a totally different planet. This place was under about a mile of ice, in fact. We've warmed the planet in the other direction by about 1 degree so far, and we're going to keep going. If we keep going to another 2, 3, or 4 degrees, that could be a world we wouldn't even recognize. It would be very, very dangerous for our civilization. So where do these gases come from? Well, I'm sure you've already heard that a lot of them come from burning fossil fuels, right? Burning oil and natural gas and coal and petroleum substitutes and all these things that we have. And that is part of the story. Burning fossil fuels does create CO2, and that causes about 62% of the warming we see on the planet today. So if you forget about everything else, fossil fuels cause more than half of climate change. But that's not all. It turns out that CO2 is also produced by a few other things, including chemistry. In fact, a lot of our industrial processes, especially making cement, releases CO2 into the atmosphere without burning anything at all. It's just kind of industrial chemistry. We also release a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere by burning down trees and deforestation. This green area shows you how much CO2 is caused by burning down forest, which is kind of like burning coal. Coal's dead, trees are alive, but they're both made out of carbon. And you burn them in our atmosphere, you will make carbon dioxide either way. Then we have our next greenhouse gas of methane. Methane is produced by a whole bunch of different things, but the two big sources are agriculture and industry. In agriculture, which is about 2/3 of this methane emissions, is caused largely from cattle. And you've heard all the jokes before, I'm sure, about cow farts. Turns out that's not even true. Cows actually burp methane. They don't fart methane any more than other animals. The other third of this methane comes from industry, especially mining natural gas. Gas wells, fracking, gas pipelines, even coal mines release methane as well. So we have to think about energy and industry and agriculture to look at methane. Then we've got this stuff called nitrous oxide, which a lot of people don't even think about, but it's a big part of our climate change equation. In nitrous oxide, some of that comes from industry, but again, a lot of it comes from agriculture, especially using too much fertilizer or too much manure on our farmers' fields. And finally, we have F gases, or fluorinated gases, which are chemicals we use as refrigerants and sometimes as insulators in industrial processes. And those refrigerants, like chlorofluorocarbons and hydrofluorocarbons, are rising dramatically, and that's why we have to pay attention to this. So putting all those gases together, we emit about 52 gigatons of the equivalent of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year. What the heck is a gigaton? It's just a fancy word for a billion metric tons. So we emit 52 billion metric tons of pollution into the atmosphere every year. But there are only 7.5 billion of us. So on average, we're emitting many, many tons of pollution per person into the atmosphere. That's a huge amount. And we're going to talk more about that and how we can cut that down. Another thing we have to notice is that each of these gases works a little bit differently. Some gases trap more heat than others, like methane and nitrous oxide, and those fluorinated gases trap way more heat molecule for molecule than CO2 does. But some gases last longer in the atmosphere than others too, and we got to take that into account. Like methane, we emit today, most of it will be gone within 10 to 20 years. CO2 we emit today will be in the air for centuries and centuries to come. So we have to look at the strength and lifetime of these different gases. In particular, when we think about methane, methane again is that part of the wedge of our whole diagram of greenhouse gases. If we look at the impact of today's emissions on climate for the next 100 years, methane will cause about 16% of that warming over a 100-year period. But if we look at the next 20 years instead, the role of methane doubles and becomes 32%. So it turns out in the near term, our climate changes are going to be caused by mainly methane and other gases. But in the long term, they're going to be dominated by things like CO2. So which gas we focus on depends a little bit on what time period of climate change you're really most concerned about. We have to look at all of them. Now that we understand what greenhouse gases are and kind of how they work, we're going to look at what regulates the level of those gases in the atmosphere, what makes them go up and what makes them go down. To do this, sometimes it's helpful to think of a bathtub. But imagine a bathtub which we can fill and empty with water. We do that every day, right? Pretty simple. When we add water to the bathtub by turning on the faucet, we scientists call that a source. It's a source of water, and it levels up the water in the bathtub. We can also remove water by opening up the drain, and scientists call that a sink. You'll hear that word a lot about sinks of greenhouse gases. The difference between the sources and the sinks determines whether the water goes up or the water goes down. Sources add and make the water go up. Sinks remove and makes the water go down. If you have a bathtub with the faucet on and the drain open, we have an interesting picture. If the sources are bigger than the sinks, the water level will still go up. But if the drain, the sink, is bigger than the faucet, the source, the the water levels will go back down again. So let's take that and apply it to Earth's atmosphere. Well, Earth's atmosphere is basically a big bathtub in the sky. We can fill it with pollution and greenhouse gases, these sources of greenhouse gases, which is largely due to us. And then we have sinks of greenhouse gases, things that pull that pollution out of the sky and put it someplace else. We have sinks on this planet of greenhouse gases, primarily in plants, on land, but also in the oceans. So here's the picture. We put pollution in the atmosphere, nature pulls it out in forests and in oceans. Now, right now, our sources of pollution, the stuff we're putting in the atmosphere, is much bigger than what nature can take out. And that's why the levels are going up. What if we reduced our pollution? What if we brought it down by a half or so? Well, then maybe nature could kind of keep up with it and pull as much pollution out of the atmosphere as we're putting in. If that were to happen, we would hit that moment of drawdown and we'd stabilize CO2 levels and they'd stay flat. We can go farther and actually reduce our pollution down to zero and pull more carbon and other stuff out of the atmosphere and actually have greenhouse gases decline and stop climate change and begin to reverse in the long term the damage we've done. So this balance between sources and sinks is what will determine the future of our planet and our climate. Now let's look at the numbers. In today's atmosphere, we see that we actually have about 6 major sources of greenhouse gas pollution. We'll go into them later, but you see electricity and food, industry, transportation, buildings, and other stuff. Then we have nature, which on land and in the oceans pull out a total of about 41% of those greenhouse gases, primarily the carbon dioxide part. That leaves behind 59% of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, building up year over year over year. So to achieve drawdown, to get them to reverse and bend the curve back down, we've got to work on both sides of this equation. We can work on the sources and bring them down to zero, kind of turning off that faucet over the coming decades, so there's no pollution there at all. And we can also work with the sinks of carbon, starting with the natural ones that already exist, and make sure they can continue to pull that stuff out of the sky. So the idea of getting to drawdown actually will be based on 3 big principles, and these are important. The first thing we've got to do, and we always need to begin here, is reduce the problem before it even starts. Let's stop pollution before it even gets in the atmosphere so it doesn't cause any problems at all. And that means bringing these emissions down to zero. So we're going to have to zoom in and look at what causes these emissions, what's in the economy, what can we do about it in all of these different sectors, from electricity to industry to agriculture and beyond. And if we do that, we can cause a big reduction in these things and eventually bring them down to zero. So job number 1, stop pollution, bring it to zero. Job number 2 will be working over in the nature space, basically supporting nature's carbon cycle and maybe even adding to it in the form of sinks. That's the right-hand side of this diagram. We'll have to zoom in here and look on land and oceans about what controls their ability to take up carbon and how can we support that and maybe even augment it, making it stronger in the future. So we've looked at the left-hand side and the right-hand side of that big picture, the sources, the sinks, and we know what to do. But there's a third area we've got to talk about too, and we'll get into this later, is about how, as we improve society, we can do things that aren't about climate change. They're things we should do anyway. But when we improve equality and equity and justice around the world, there are things we do there that actually have major secondary climate benefits. So we might get a twofer of improving human rights and equality and contributing to climate solutions. So working together, reducing pollution, supporting nature, and improving society are the 3 pillars of our climate solution space. Building on these 3 pillars and pulling them together all at the same time, we actually have all we need to address climate change in the coming decades. And this is going to be our job over the next few units of this course.
All right. So we watched session or unit 1 and unit 2. So just to lay out kind of the plan that we have here and ready is that 2 weeks from tonight, Same time, not the same place. I'll say that again in just a moment. But 2 weeks from tonight, we will have our second session and we'll do units 3 and 4. So it's going to be building on what we just saw with unit 1 and 2. We'll have a different facilitator, Winona Bateman from Missoula, from Families for a Livable Climate. She will talk in with a great wonder about having climate conversations, how to effectively have climate conversations and other solutions. So please show up 2 weeks. It's going to be in a different venue. It's going to be more or less across the street at the Bitterroot College. The information is on the handout. 2 weeks after that, the next Tuesday night, two weeks after that, we'll be back in this room and we'll do the last 2 units, units 5 and 6. And our facilitator will be Peter Reynolds right here in front, who is the chair of Bitterroot Climate Action Group. And the talk will be, just based on what we've been saying, whatever anyone wants to bring up in the conversation, whatever questions, comments we have, but really about what has been going on here in the Bitterroot Valley and what we can continue to do and how we can grow that. So I also want to say, in these units, there's so much information. It's kind of overwhelming. I've watched it now 4 times, all of it, and it is available online. It's free. Anyone can watch it. You just either go to the website Project Drawdown, or you can go to the BCAG website and we'll have a link to it. So you can watch all of them. There are additional resources on there. Each of the units have 2 interviews with people, which are really good. Those run about 30 minutes each. So there's all sorts of information there. Amy, we hold this for just a second. So I just want to call attention to these 2 books. Drawdown, which is edited by Paul Hawken, is where all of this came from. This was published in 2017. And this book is set up to have so much of the things that we're already watching. A second edition, Regeneration, just came out in November of 2020. Bitterroot Climate Action Group has a book club. We have our book club mentor right here. And the book that is going to be started in May will be Regeneration. So that will build upon this as well. And this is all based on climate solutions, every single part of it. And now it is my great honor and privilege to introduce one of my personal heroes, Amy Cilimburg, right here next to me. So she's the executive director of Climate Smart Missoula, where she develops local climate solutions and works to build networks and community resiliency. Amy has helped launch Climate Smart in 2015, so it's been a bunch of years now, following efforts to develop Missoula's municipal and community climate action plans. And she's worked on climate and energy policy and conservation for over a decade, so lots of experience here. Amy has an MS in wildlife biology from the University of Montana, and she's worked at UM as the associate director for the Avian Science Center. She's presently on the board of Missoula's Mountain Line Transit System. And I also want to give her a very big public thanks and gratitude for all the help she's given BCAG, starting when we first started. She drove down to the Bitterroot Valley on a Friday evening in the middle of the summer, together with people to help us, inspire us, share her knowledge. And she's continued that all the way until tonight. So thank you, Amy.
So that's okay. Thank you guys for having me. That's a little much. Hillary may be inspired by me, but I am truly inspired when I get to come out and talk to people or work with people or have conversations with people. And this feels a little funny because I don't think I've done a talk or just even come out for 2 years. I feel like when I went to Brandy Carlisle concert last summer and she's like, I'm so nervous. It's my first concert in 2 years. I kind of feel that way. Like, how do we do this? But it's wonderful. Thank you, Cindy, to be together and to feel like we have the ability to come back together. I feel like a little bit of our movement has been challenged by the last couple of years. So I'm really glad you guys all came, and I'm really excited to see where you guys all go with this work. And I know there's a lot of deep knowledge and people that have been working on climate and environmental work and sustainability here for decades. So thank you for all you guys do. How we doing? Does that? We ready? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share, I have about 79 slides. I have an hour and a half to give slides, right? No, okay, I won't. I have about 15 slides or so, but I want to talk a little bit about the work that we do, that we've done up in Missoula with Climate Smart, and give you a little bit of ideas of kind of how our evolution of thinking has shifted about what and how we make change and how we do this work together. And when I was talking to Hillary about this talk, she really wanted me to talk about the how. How do we make this kind of change? But when I started thinking about it, the how and the what and the who, it's all wrapped up. So I will share a few ideas, run through some slides. If you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. But then there'll be plenty of time that we can just talk and hear from you all about ideas you have and questions you may have and where we should all go from here. All right. So yes, Climate Smart Missoula, we're a small organization. Our mission is to engage our community in climate actions, catalyzing efforts to reduce our carbon footprint in the community sense of that, and build a resilient Missoula, and to potentially help do that across the state and beyond. Oops, that's okay. So myself, Abby has started here when pretty soon after I started, and then Kelly Littleton's doing some buildings work. She started about a year ago, and Mary Sullivan started 2 days ago. So we're just a small team. We have a board, and we try to work with a lot of volunteers and other folks. And so when we first started and I would give these talks, it seems like I was oftentimes doing bird stuff. So I'd have a picture of a bird and I'd tell a little bit about who I was, and then I'd talk about the problem, and then I'd talk about what individuals can do and maybe what we could do at the community, the state, and the federal level. And it felt really linear, and it was a lot of talk about what we should do individually. And that's a lot of what Climate Smart started out doing. And now we're thinking a little bit differently about how our individual actions can be part of systemic change, and really trying to tackle things at the pace and scale, even though we're just a small organization in Missoula. And so that's some of what I want to share. So, and I also want to speak to the moment. These are really hard times. What is happening in Europe and in Ukraine is truly heartbreaking, and we are connected. And I think when I first started doing this world, I felt like, okay, it's a big world and we're all connected, but we're just going to act locally, maybe think globally, but work locally. And now it's become really apparent that what we do here is, influenced by what's happening with Russia and Ukraine and around the world. And it's had me shift a little bit how I think about the work that we do, and how it is very hopeful. It's also very hard, and hope isn't free. And we have to sort of wrestle with that every day and still get up and do the good work. The latest IPCC report, IPCC, sorry about that, spelling error there, came out just as the war in Ukraine was starting, and it didn't get a lot of attention, but it's really quite dire if we don't act. If we act, it's not quite dire, but if we don't act collectively and with intention, it's been called the Code Red for Humanity. Antonio Guterres is also now speaking out about this moment that we are in, that if we just continue to drill fossil fuels and try to make up for the challenges of this war by further drilling for fossil fuels, making it easier to, sorry about that, I'm gonna stay in front of the camera here, making it easier to drill, building LNG terminals, pipelines, all of that work, it's madness, right? Our addiction to fossil fuels is mutually assured destruction, coming from the Secretary General of the UN. And sometimes I have to remind myself that the stakes are that big, and it's madness. And it's really interesting that we actually have a pretty big role to play in that conversation here in Montana, given all the renewable energy we have, and given that we also drill and mine for coal. And we really can wrestle with that, and also have some ways to shift that and shift those conversations. So this is it's all feels like it's all very different, and I just kind of want to acknowledge that. Part of working on climate change, at least for me and for our organization, is thinking that we have a roadmap and we're moving forward, and then being willing to pivot and change. And it's really pretty messy. But what we do know, see, maybe next slide, is that The stuff at the top, like which mushroom we are any one day, which person, how we're doing things, may seem to shift. But what's really important are the networks, the mycelium underground. I've started to think of our work as really, we're just a bunch of mycelium under the ground. You can't see it, but if we're working here in the Bitterroot and you guys are all connected and you're connected to us, there's a lot to that. Sure, there's some cool, beautiful mushrooms on the top sometimes, but sometimes you don't even see that. And I think that's really important for us to make any difference of the world in this world. It's strengthening those connections, having conversations. And I know I know when Winona's going to talk about that when she comes in 2 weeks, and she's beautiful at communicating and inspiring people to communicate. But it's these connections that really matter. And that allows us, the richer our connections, the easier we can shift our focus as the need comes. And that's really been important. And I'll talk a bit about that as we go ahead. So when we started, or Climate Smart, we kind of do work on 3 different prongs. Resiliency and adaptation, and I'll just briefly speak to a couple ideas here. Mitigation, how do we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels? And then engagement and movement building. And again, I'll just kind of mention a little bit, because that is the frame that we work. It's like the 3 legs of the stool that our organization focus on. So click away there. Oh, and we are, again, trying to meet that moment that we are in today. Tomorrow, yesterday. Climate Ready Missoula is a plan we have for all of Missoula County that we were pretty instrumental in bringing forward. It passed as an official policy of both our county and our city. So that gives it a little bit of teeth. It gives it some ability to make change, because it is an official plan of our local government and basically our resilience plan. And it's how we address transportation, but especially health and climate, wildfire smoke, heat, their agriculture. There's a whole bunch of things that will help build resiliency in Missoula, and it's a pretty neat plan. And I could share a little bit more about how we made that happen. Sometimes starting with resiliency and talking about those things can help people feel a little more comfortable talking about, like, how do we get rid of fossil fuels or reduce our actual emissions. And the big things that we have worked on since Climate Smart got started, and a big part of our climate resilience work and Climate Ready Missoula, is dealing not just with wildfires and the WUI and all the challenges there, but also around the smoke. The more we learn about wildfire smoke, the more frightening it really is. The more we know about air pollution, especially with children. Anybody see that article that came out this weekend? It was at least in the Missoulian, that wildfire smoke changed the DNA of these rhesus monkeys. So children and wildfire smokes are like a bad idea. And so we've had this program, and I know you guys are doing some of this work too. I won't spend too much time on it, but getting clean indoor air to the people that need it most. Homebound seniors that don't have clean air, preschools and daycares. Now a lot more of the preschools and daycares have HEPA air filters because of COVID. But we've had a whole program on trying to figure out who and what is most vulnerable, and then see where we can help and where we can, how we can learn more. And I think there's some great work going. There's lots more to do. It's like a small little nonprofit of 4 people can't really outfit our entire community with HEPA air filters, but how do we make that more the norm? And our experience has been that we are now talking about it as a climate change issue. So our health department now talks about, hey, we need more air filters. We need to figure out commercial spaces, because climate change is making our wildfire smoke season longer, and therefore we're getting smoke inside the schools where kids are learning. And they're making that connection, and they're being willing to talk about it publicly. So normalizing that conversation can really be a part of climate resiliency conversations, normalizing the bringing climate change into it. And then we also are working even a lot more on extreme heat. I mean, I think all of us were pretty shocked at what happened in the Pacific Northwest last summer. People died. It was 118 degrees. If that happens here, are we prepared? We're not. So we've been thinking about this for a while. We've built some shade shelters. We talk about drought. We've been encouraging growing our urban forests and watering trees, but there's a lot to do in that. And in Missoula, one of the things we're working on is an extreme heat preparedness plan. What would we do if it was 118 degrees for days on end? And then there's, of course, when wildfire smoke and extreme heat mix, and that's complicated too. But trying to address those, trying to think about who's most vulnerable and how we don't leave people behind is a big part of what we do. And then, of course, there's the mitigation. We've long been like, let's get solar panels, let's put them out places, let's work on energy conservation and efficiency projects. There is a lot we can do with distributed energy, and it's a big part of the solution. We also helped pass 100% clean electricity goal for our community, and that has our community now working really hard. It's not easy. We have a utility that's not very favorable to try to get big, like a big commercial scale solar that we could buy into and we could commit to. That's ongoing painful negotiations. But if Hamilton had a goal of 100% clean electricity, even if the goal was like out there in a bunch of decades, it would be really cool, because the more of those communities, the more then our utility, Northwestern Energy, kind of has to listen to us. So that's just a bug we could talk about, or put that bug in your ear. The big thing that we are working on right now, and this is again that pivot that we've made, is this idea that we need to electrify everything. So we electrify our transportation system. We've put the solar on the roofs of commercial spaces and residents. And then we electrify all the appliances and the equipment inside those buildings. And it's really pretty cool that this is like what a lot of people are talking about is what we really need to do. We just got rid of our natural gas stove because now we understand that pollution from methane gas is just really bad. We have an induction stove, and we're working on actually trying to get rid of methane gas into our house and get some heat pumps, and this whole system of heat pumps that we can talk more about what they are. There's actually this great book, if you haven't seen it, Electrify. I'm sure it's going to be in more of the drawdown things, but this book called Electrify, an Optimist Playbook for a Clean Energy Future is really good. There's a website and organization, Rewiring America, and it's all about moving everything to electricity. And then we also simultaneously green the grid. So we get rid of coal, we have renewables, batteries, all kinds of things, and then everything is run on electricity. And when you do the numbers and look at that, and I know they're going to talk more about this, so I won't talk too much about it. It really works. The numbers actually work, and it's something that can be that we can do this across the world, because wind energy or wind and sun shines, and it doesn't get any more expensive. There's no like variation in the sun. It's still just free, which is very different than oil and gas right now. And what's interesting about this process is we're at the beginnings of this in Montana, especially, and it doesn't seem like something big, but if you actually, people start calling contractors, HVAC contractors, and say, hey, I'm interested in heat pumps. The first person you're going to call is going to say, oh, we don't do those. Too cold here. And then the next guy or gal is going to say that over and over again. And then they're going to start getting 10 calls, and they're going to be like, oh, wait a minute. People really want this. I wonder how I could get trained to do this. And then DEQ offers trainings, or we bring trainings out here. And it's really one of those things that we have to start asking for it and demanding it before we're going to get the workforce and the contractors to do it. And that's something that individuals can do and can talk to each other about. So we're at the beginnings of an Electrify movement, but the more we think about it and talk about it and build it, the more we'll start to be there. And the whole idea here is not to just take your house apart and electrify everything, but trying to build the infrastructure so that when your boiler does go out, or when you do need a new stove or a water heater, there are contractors available to give you what you need, and then we don't have to rely on gas. We're working in Missoula right now to figure out if we can incentivize new developments to just say no to gas right from the get-go. And that, I think, because those are 20 and 30 and 100-year decisions you're making. So a lot of the things in the shift in my mind about how we're working on making change right now is trying to help people see what are the big decisions and how can I make the right big decisions, or help my business do that, or help my neighbor do that when all of a sudden they call you up and it's Christmas Day and their boiler blew out. You're like, oh, I have an idea for you. So let's see. And it's funny because there's all this heat pumps. You'll learn more about it. We'll talk more about it. They're not sexy, but they're trying to figure out how do we make them sexy. They call it a heat pump. Like, we have to figure out how to talk about heat pumps. It's sort of an evolution. But that's some of what's interesting about that resiliency mitigation prong is when it comes to buildings, the two come together. Because if we have HVAC heat pump systems that both heat and cool your air, you're going to be more comfortable when there's an extreme heat, and you're going to be healthier. We're going to have better mental health, because we know when it gets hot, people's mental health can deteriorate. It's a kind of a dangerous time. And so we can have cleaner indoor air at the same time that we have more comfortable homes, and we're solving climate change. So finding those places where we have co-benefits, or we can bring resiliency and adaptation together, is a lot of where we, at least in Climate Smart and working with our partners, are trying to go. So then we have to get to that engagement and movement building. How do we do this, and how do we actually really make this happen? It's big systemic change. So slow down just a second. Yeah, big systemic change is really just thinking about not just my individual behavior, but how can I be part of something bigger? And really, I just wanted to make this point, because again, it's been an evolution that we've had. You know, those times where you're like in the grocery store and you're agonizing over, this bottle of detergent has more plastic than this one, but this one has phosphorus in it, and how do I decide? And oh my God, and that has been that decision and that paralysis, because there's so many choices we have to make about plastics and about recycling and about how far we drive and whether we actually fly to see grandma. The oil and gas companies want us to be having that. They want us to be angry about that and be confused about that, so we don't actually strive for the big systemic changes that we need. So this is a little like my permission that I've been giving myself, and the grace we all need to give ourselves and each other, that we are imperfect. We will buy a little plastic. I am flying home to the memorial service for my father this spring, but I'm working for those bigger changes. And that can be part, if we're thinking about that in our conversation as we work together as a group, it really can change faster, and we don't have to be miserable. We can actually feel good about it as we go along. A couple more things here. One, I know that Winona is going to encourage you to have climate conversations and talk to people, but I just really wanted to, in case you're not here in 2 weeks, it is so important that the individuals be things that we do are great. And if we talk about them, they're really, really, really great, right? So if I let people know that, you know, I actually went out and got an electric lawnmower. I know that seems kind of silly, but I'm really worried about climate change. And would you like to borrow it? Says the guy across the street, or what, you know, I don't know. Like, if we just do the things that we do to make the world a better place, but we don't tell anybody about them, it's not gonna be big enough and fast enough to make the changes that we need. But we can talk about it. And I feel like one of the things, you know, if you guys would say, you know, I just went to this really awesome lecture by Winona Bateman, and this group, Bitterroot Climate Action Group, is getting going. Maybe you want to join me at the next meeting when somebody says, hey, you know, did you do anything interesting? Yeah. Drawdown, super cool. Like, we have to start having these conversations and letting people know what we care about. There's some really interesting social science that I listen to a lot of podcasts, but there's one podcast where they were talking about how in the civil rights movement, who some people may have actually been involved in it, I was a little young. Not that I was born, I was a little young. Everybody kind of thinks that the US wasn't ready for civil rights, but the courts made it happen. And really, when they were doing polling and they were working with people, the people were ready for it. The people were ready to have it, but they weren't necessarily talking or being willing to say, you know, I actually believe in equality and I believe in gay rights and all those things, because we often are scared to talk about some of those things. So a lot of times the polling is really good. And actually in Montana, we believe in climate change. We love solar, we love wind. We're really not that excited to keep burning coal forever, but we often forget that that's really sort of the norm. So we do, the more we can talk about it, the more people will realize, oh, actually my neighbor, I didn't think so, but he actually was really interested in maybe getting an EV because they actually care about climate change. So I know you're going to talk more about that. We could talk more about it here in just a second, but and again, Winona has lots of ideas for those climate conversations. Okay, I just have a couple more. One of the biggest things that I think we're all reckoning with right now is that these are some sculptures and some art about politicians who are either drowning because climate change, or you know, they have their briefcases and their heads are in the sand. And I think there's some really brilliant art that has us really thinking, can really help us think about like what is at stake and how to visualize that. But I was looking for something that just spoke to the fact that we need leaders that are making the decisions that actually solve climate change. And that's where we need to talk about it. We need to ask everybody running from office what they're going to do. Sorry, thank you, Cindy, about climate change. Is it on their agenda? We need to work to elect those people that want to make climates that believe in climate solutions. And you know, at Climate Smart, we're a 501c3. We don't actually endorse candidates, but we can encourage people to do that work and get involved. And I really believe that the primaries, but especially come November, that's going to make or break whether we can make the big systemic change we need in our country to lead, because we need that in Congress. And so anyways, happy to talk more about that too. But actually, you know, some people will argue that the number one thing you can do for climate change is work on a campaign for somebody you believe in and make sure that we actually have a functioning democracy, because we can't work on climate change and solve climate change without a functioning democracy. And I also think that maybe next slide here, boy, a creative response and getting people to not just talk about climate change, but maybe do art, maybe connect with youth, maybe have an art show down here, all kinds of these. This is a panel we have in front of our office. The background's not very nice, but visualizing climate, we're trying to help young artists like bring forward their ideas, because a lot of young people are actually really scared right now and they really don't know what to do. And you give them a big mural and some paint and they can really create some neat ideas. So we've been trying to connect with youth and wish we could do more with that. Okay, I think I just have a couple more. Getting people together, talking about it, also rallying, getting people out there can be really helpful to move forward on climate. And then I want to end with just some ideas. Go ahead. This is the climate action Venn diagram. Has anybody seen this before? Has anybody done this before? Okay, so I'm a big fan of this because after even thinking about all of this, it's like, okay, what do I do? You know, I still want to compost. How do I get change my car, change my heating system or whatever? Or where do you want to be involved in the movement? It's pretty simple. You can think about what brings you joy, and you can think about what is needed to solve climate change. And then you can think about what can you do and what you can offer. And where those intersect is maybe the place that you want to start or continue or be. And I will say that you know, sometimes you actually have to challenge yourself a little bit. Sometimes what brings me joy is not door knocking for candidates. It's really not that fun. Actually, I don't mind it. Phone calls, that's hard. Some of it maybe you have to stretch what we really think brings us joy, and what we can do and offer may shift over time. But if you think about it that way, it really, everybody has something to give to the climate solutions. We have like one or two more. So we did this just for our team. You know, what brings us joy? Coffee, babies, creativity, and writing. You know, we just kind of tried to put a whole bunch of ideas together. And then, you know, at the middle, we try to pull that in. Doesn't work as well for an organization, but it does really get you thinking. It's actually something that we've done for the last 2 hires at Climate Smart. That's been part of their they put forward their cover letter, their resume, and we have them do a Venn diagram. People that have a Venn diagram where there's no intersection of those 3 bubbles, we didn't interview them. You have to know what a Venn diagram is. We figured that's not too much to ask, but really it's the intersection of what needs to get done, what could we do, and what brings us joy. And then click away again. If we all do that, and we have a whole bunch of Venn diagrams, then we are that connected mycelium of mushrooms, because that's how really it builds and things can happen. Go ahead. And then, yeah, I can stop there and talk a little bit about what brings you hope. What kind of work do you guys want to do? Questions you have, things like that. I think we still have some time left. Sorry, turns out I dance. Questions?
Where do you find volunteers and your board members?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I will. So how do we at Climate Smart find our board members or volunteers, recruitment? Our board members kind of just came to us as we were evolving from being a fiscally sponsored organization to having our own nonprofit. And there are a few people that I kind of plucked out of the, people I knew or we knew that said, hey, would you want to join our board? We have a kind of small board, 7 people. Volunteers, it's really, we do put out requests for volunteers. Hey, we're doing a restoration planting along the river. Given climate change, we really need to have a healthy riparian forest. And we put out the word and people tend to sign up. But sometimes for specific things, we actually, I think this would be a great opportunity. Could you help us? And we sometimes have to ask people individually that we know. So I think it's just a mix of all of that. I think sometimes you put out the word and sometimes we get more volunteers than we really can use well, because I think people are looking for something to do. Yeah, Jill.
You said you have a 100% clean energy goal that was passed. Who passed it?
So that's a good question. So the question, we have 100% clean, it's a clean electricity goal that was passed. And what it was a resolution that our city council passed, as did our county commissioners. And it's for the Missoula urban area. And I know that might seem difficult, but 8 years ago, our county commission wouldn't have done that. And now they're really pretty, they will talk about a climate emergency. Sometimes in a lot of communities it's easier for like the urban center, city commission, and it's just passed as a resolution. And that means we can kind of hold their feet to the fire. It means for our city and county, it means that they've had to put some funding into capacity to have staff that work on it is one of the big things that it's offered. And then we've worked with other communities that have that goal. And so it's been a really important one. Helena has a goal. Bozeman has a goal. We'd love other communities to join because it's strength in numbers when you go to Northwestern Energy for sure. Yeah.
Do different cities have the same end date for their goals?
I think that, thank you, Cindy. I'm supposed to repeat the question for the Facebook audience or recording. The question is, do the different cities have different endpoints? And I think that Bozeman is also 2030. Helena might be 2035. There's a lot of 2030, 2035 goals. In some ways, that number, I don't think you have to get too hung up on. It just means, hey, this is where we need to head. And it's making that sort of official statement that you're headed that way. But like 2030 is not very far away. We only have 8 years in Missoula. We got a long ways to go. Other comments or questions that you guys want to share?
You mentioned
yes.
For solar energy.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of people that it's always in the back of the mind. But it's, you call.
Yeah.
It would be so helpful, I think, to have a weekend, for example, where you have people who do that kind of work,
yeah,
come and be able to talk to, have a challenge.
Yeah.
Several hours, so people can and promote it and advertise so people can say, oh, that would be easy to go down.
Right, right. So yeah.
We had originally an aerator pump.
Mm-hmm.
That was
right. Yeah. So the heat pumps, we could talk about heat pumps for hours, although I'm not an engineer or a contractor. And I don't know if they do come up in more conversations. Maybe that's something we could, you guys could discuss more. But one, for retrofits, it is complicated. Like what kind of a system would work best? Every building is different, every home is different, and it is complicated. So what we're trying to do right now is help build that workforce. So there's more of those people that can answer those questions. And we are trying to get them together. We are doing a webinar April 5th to talk more about that. And I can send that information to Hillary. She can share it with you all. It's online, so you can just zoom in. But we are trying to get those folks together. And we're working right now with our state energy office, and they have some funding. Hopefully, no promises, but we're thinking about some contractor training so that there's more contractors. So it is something that we're working on. If in newer construction, it's a little easier. A lot of new construction is actually making that choice now because it can be cheaper. And the technology is just getting better. So a heat pump of 5 years ago, it was hard to get to the cold temperatures we have, and they're getting better and better. So Minnesota has a great program. It's really cold in Minnesota. We learned from Northern Europe and things. So yes, we need to get together on those and figure out how to share that information. I will say the solar thing is a lot more straightforward. You go, you put it on the roof. Maybe your roof needs to be a little bit strengthened, and maybe you need a new inverter box or a different electrical box or something, but it is way more straightforward, and the solar companies in Western Montana are great there. So look at that. And then the other thing I will just say is we're really trying to think about this stuff in terms of equity. So the people with the means could maybe go out and get a new heat pump that will cost more, or a heat pump water heater that will cost more. And maybe they'll get an EV, and maybe they'll get solar panels. But how about the folks that can't afford to do that? And so two things. One, early adopters do help push the market, and the more people that adopt it, the prices will go down. And then two, there's still some really good hope that there could be some additional federal legislation, reconciliation bill that would offer direct rebates to people. So not just like a break on your taxes, but here, if you do this, here's $500, here's $800, actual real money. And then the last thing is, if a lot of people don't know, but Northwestern Energy, how many people are Northwestern Energy customers? Yeah, some people might be co-op. If they do have a residential rebate program now, and you can get some money back for some of these bigger ticket items and even small items. Did you know that if you buy an Energy Star printer, you can get 50-cent rebate? Just pointing that out. That's what our utility has for us. True, 50 cents. But they also have on there that you could get $100 back on a HEPA air filter. So buy it early and see if that works. That's someone says. So it's a very interesting list. But there's bigger money rebates from Northwestern Energy for heat pumps, ground source and air source. Yeah, back. Hello. Okay, great. Well, so the question is, do heat pumps have fluorocarbon issues with them like refrigerants? They do work like refrigerators, right? So the way they operate is that they bring in air and condense it with the refrigerant and pull out the heat, bring it into your home, and then the reverse happens when they're cooling. So it's basically like a big refrigerator in that sense. There is continued work to improve the refrigerants, and they have fewer and fewer heat trapping, pollutants in them over time. I don't know exactly where we are with that, but most people are not too freaked out about that because it's pretty small. Dealing with old refrigerants and trying to take what's those old, the refrigerant materials and try to reuse or recycle those is really important. I think it's one of the things maybe they even talk about in Drawdown. But so they're hope isn't free. Dealing with climate change isn't free either. There are problems with a lot of this. There's problems with mining in terms of the heavy metals and the particular metals we need. But we can do a lot of that better. And there's actually some really exciting opportunities to reuse and recycle all of that material. And there's money that this administration at the federal level is putting into that. Like a lot of money into how do we recycle batteries? How do we make that real?
There's a builder in the valley who installed a carbon dioxide heat pump. Didn't have the refrigerants. It was from some country in Europe. They had to bring it over. But it was state of the art. That's Terry Davenport.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
He does-
He's been around for a long time doing great things. Okay, so at carbon dioxide heat pump, I don't know much about him, but yeah, that's really great. So a lot of it, I mean, this is the time where we have to test some new things, and we have to see what works and learn as we go and share what we learn. That's really cool to know.
A lot of people in the valley burn wood, and the first argument is it's grown up on a human time scale, and we got to let it stand.
Yeah.
But why is that a bad idea?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to say why burning wood is a bad idea. I think it has a place in some homes if it's burned well, and if you're really considering the air quality. I really get concerned about the indoor air quality in wood with people that have wood burning stoves, especially older ones, or especially if they don't just use them well. So those people should absolutely have HEPA air filters and replace replace the filter in the insides. What my understanding about that is there's a scale that for which that can work, because we are around forests, and we do have a lot of wood, some wood that's going to burn anyway. It's not the end all be all. It's not something that can continue to expand and grow over time. So to my mind, it's easier to maybe use wood and until maybe at some point when it's affordable to replace that with something else. I would be more comfortable with that than put in a new gas line so you can burn methane gas for the next 100 years like that. So some of this is kind of trying to figure out like what's better and what's worse. Do other people have experience or opinions around wood stoves? It's not the sword I'm going to fall on, I guess I would say. Anybody else? Yeah.
I have a wood stove, and heat it with on coal, and I burn it hot.
Yeah.
It's really hot.
Yeah.
All the time, and then let it go off.
Yeah.
And when it gets cold in the house, then I'm not that time burn it hot. All the time. And it keeps the stovepipe clean. Yeah,
I think wood stoves are mostly a problem for people that don't know how to use them well. And, you could get, if you have a wood stove, you could get a little purple air monitor or one of those inexpensive monitors that let you know what your PM 2.5 particulate matters, your really small particulate matters are in your home. And that might influence whether you get another HEPA air filter. So cleaning your indoor air when you're burning with a wood stove, I think is just really important, because it might feel, that the problem with the air pollution that's the most dangerous for our lungs and our brains and cardio systems is the stuff that you don't see, smell, taste, and you don't know that it's there. So that might be one thing. But yeah, I think people they don't know how to use it. And the other piece that's obvious to all of this, we just didn't touch on, is, if whatever system you're using, wood stove or heat pumps, the better your house is weatherized, the less you're going to need to use it, and you can use it better. So I think that's something that is really encouraging a lot more interest all of a sudden in weatherizing homes, not all of a sudden, but a continued growth and interest in insulating homes, making homes so they don't need as much energy, building smart, building smaller homes, for instance, so you don't necessarily need to use as much energy to heat them, and much embodied carbon that goes into it. So there's more to all of this, but I think we forget some of that. Really, so the basic stuff needs to be part of the conversation for sure. I think it's great that you guys are here and that you're interested and that you have this Bitterroot Climate Action Group. And thank you to the leaders that keep it going. I hope you guys, and it's really cool you have a book club. That's what we want to do. What's cool about these groups is you may not know, but I can bring some ideas back, and it's just neat to know that these different groups are happening and we can share ideas and resources together. I was the only other book I brought from my library, and it sounds like you guys, some folks have read this, All We Can Save. I think that's really an excellent book. There's just so many wonderful resources, and sometimes I know I tap into this, books that are out there, just inspiring podcasts and things, because it is hard work. And it's important to remember that there are going to be days where you're going to feel like, this is just too hard. And that's okay. Like you can step away, you can go watch some birds, dig in the soil, plant your garden, all those kinds of things. And then I do come back to some of those great authors, writers, singers, people that give you inspiration. So I think in all of this, it's important to do that.
One of my favorite climate solutions that I've seen in a variety of places is to go out and respect, and I enjoy anything like
Yes.
I really enjoy outdoor.
Yeah.
So that's one of my favorite ones.
Yes, I think that's so important to enjoy this world. I mean, why are you going to fight for a world you don't actually really like, right? Oh, it's another ugly gray day. I mean, it was wonderful to drive. I actually did my master's research down here and on yellow warblers, and it was just so great to drive back down here. And it's a beautiful place. And we can forget that when we realize that the world is so big, or we think it's unimportant when we know that other parts of the world are really struggling. And I think we do have to remind ourselves and help each other. There's a lot. A big part of some of what we're doing up in Missoula is trying to build a stronger mental health network, and so people can have conversations with each other, not about just a solution, but just about the grief and the challenge and the fear, and then get people to think about, just going outside and going to a comedy show, doing something that keeps you going and laughing. So thank you for that, Hillary. Yeah.
Ravalli County is a lot and I'm saying, okay, I read the paper. No question, climate change is
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm looking at where I live here, Ravalli County. I'm thinking, how many people read? That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, I love the story of the mushrooms and
Yeah.
internet and the
Interconnections. Yeah.
I think if I was looking at the vast majority of our county, without being, I think that TV is one of the primary ways of. I don't have TV, so I don't know that. I'm just guessing that most people watch TV a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm leading to is, I guess I'm asking you, is there any intention, or is it happening, and I don't know about it, where climate actions and climate concerns start becoming part of the commercial, part of TV, where people start they're watching all of it. Do they watch all of it? No, I just don't watch.
Right. No, how does it get normalized in just mainstream TV climate change? And we've seen that happen over time with LGBT issues, right? I mean, or interracial, there were no interracial marriages depicted in like your basic, sort of TV show. I don't know exactly what is mainstream TV anymore, because now there's so much, there's Hulu, Netflix, all these different kinds of TV. So people can be really choosy and they can stay in their comfort zone. So it is harder we fully admit that growing the mycelium and staying connected is harder if people are just kind of going to the news and the media that they like. I do think that there are some new, like usually climate change is addressed in, my understanding anyway, is more in like sci-fi, and it's all dystopic and it's all like the end of the world. But I was listening to a philosopher who's actually part of developing a new climate series on like Apple TV that's supposed to be like real and happening and supposed to be really good. I don't know what it's called and it's not out yet, but does anybody know?
So I stream, and I just got on Hulu. And it's like, I'm telling you, those commercials are the best. It's like, wow, like, what we're talking about here.
So not just the shows, but the actual commercials.
Commercials.
Ah.
And then I've gotten off of that because they've got an algorithm. I'm like 65, and they give me all this, all these drug commercials. I get rid of that. now it seems like really, I am blown away by the commercials.
Yeah. So,
Like happening.
and I think that brings up a really good point. Like, one of the things that people are recognizing is that climate change is now, it's such an existential threat, and it's such a threat to our financial world that banks are starting to deal with it and address it. Big business is starting to deal with it. I mean, one of the interveners at the Public Service Commission in order to get an option for better renewable energy is Walmart. So there's more of our large and small businesses that are willing to do things and are also looking at, the insurance companies like, whoa, we can't insure it. It's like, so that's there's lots of conversations. I don't know if that's part of Drawdown, but it is more of a conversation and becoming like not just something that's whispered in the hallways. It's like, we have to deal with climate risks. So that's an actual hopeful thing. And then I think some of those companies are trying to do more. We've actually seen some really good commitments from a lot of businesses, some of which are actually followed up with plans. Like they're actually trying to figure it out. And then there's commitments from oil and gas companies and utilities where they have a commitment and it's out there in 2050 or 2080 and there's no plan to get there. So we need to push those companies. Where's your plan? Okay, that's a great commitment. Step one, now give us a plan. So it is becoming more mainstream as people are realizing and the effectiveness. So, I mean, compared to 10 years ago where we did feel like we were a little like sore thumb out here thinking climate change, it isn't as weird to talk about. And I think that's good to acknowledge and remember. People tend to avoid some of those conversations, avoid thinking about it, talking about it, maybe within their businesses or wherever. I think sometimes that's because they think nobody else cares. And really, sometimes people actually care a lot, but it's so big, they don't know how to step into that world of that conversation. A lot of faith communities are doing some really great things. And then there's a trickle over ripple effect to businesses from there. TV has some catching up to do. Did people see the Leonardo DiCaprio movie? Did anybody watch it like 4 times? Yeah, Don't Look Up. I thought it was so good because we were able to kind of laugh and cry at the same time. So I do agree that we need more, we need more of a creative response to this. It's art, it's music, it's TV, So, and the other thing is, maybe how do we engage more youth and youth in this valley? Like you're talking about maybe feeling like, it's not Missoula, but there are people in high school learning the science and wondering what they can do about it. There's Bitter College. I don't know. I feel like there's maybe some inroads and conversations there. I would hope so. Yeah. I think there's this good opportunity to and it may not be everyone, but sometimes by extending an invitation to youth or working with them and saying, hey, we've got $1,000. You guys want to do a climate art project or something like that? I don't know. They'll be like, oh, I'm not alone. Like, I don't know. There's some really interesting ways we can. So think about all the great ideas you're going to have in this series. And compost and eat your local veggies. Is that what you were going to say, Jill? Because it's true. I do really believe in composting. And yeah. And that's what, I think that what we're thinking about right now, because of this war, which is a petrol war. I mean, they're doing what they're doing because 60% of their economy is oil and gas. And it makes me think like this is just way more of a reason why we should be eating locally and avoiding those food miles and focusing local on some of the big things, because we all drink local beer, that kind of stuff. Yes.
That's what I touch on something. I have a completely different viewpoint on the subject. And I might be able to illustrate it by commenting on that throughout this Ukraine crisis, which has been very exciting, there's been no mention of the fact that we all have the alternative of dramatically reducing our fossil fuel consumption at this moment. And if we do, that will further the economic effects of the sanctions and other activities. And I'm saying that because I think, quite honestly, your presentation, everything I hear about climate change is so radically Pollyannish. it's almost hard to relate to for a thing from the first place. Here we have this confluence of events that should have resulted in messages. Stop driving, carpool, save every gallon of gas that you can, in furtherance of the humanitarian needs of the people. Didn't happen. And so I'm just saying that there's these bigger messages that never get out there. 737 MAX airplane, they're all grounded. They're on the ground. You hear stories about how they're all on the ground. And then the very next news story is a story about climate change. Well, we need to keep those planes on the ground. We need to stop building airplanes. Otherwise, there is absolutely no way, regardless of the Pollyannish speaker who's in the videos that we've shown, to address what's happening. And so, if I could just follow that up with a question, if there are other people in this community or in this group that are interested in looking at the messages from a little bit more pointed emphasis, I'd be happy to communicate with him, because that's worth explaining to people. You can do something to help Ukrainians right now by reducing the amount of gas we burn. Very good. It will have a ripple.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I was sort of trying to make that point with the UN, Antonio Guterres, because that is the point that he's exactly making. Like we can, and to be honest, maybe I didn't make that point here, but I have seen a lot of those messages across social media, Twitter, Facebook, people saying the thing I can do right now is to reduce that demand on gasoline. But then where do we go from that? How do we then build something different? And I guess what I was trying to do in this conversation was think about the different world we're building. But I actually completely 100% agree with you that is, people thinking right now about, oh, this is an oil and gas. I need to take the bus. I'm on the board of the bus I just take the bus this week, and I rode my bike this week, and I was like, let's see, today's only Tuesday, last week. Anyway, I have seen people both doing that behavior and talking about it, but I do feel like it's getting drowned out, and I totally agree. We don't make the connection. We have a climate change story, and then we have a Ukraine story, and then we have maybe somebody that makes the connection, but then that's dropped, and we don't continue to build that understanding that these things are connected. So it was why I brought that up. I may not have done it very well, apologize for that. But I think we have to wrestle with that, and we have to talk about it, which is my point. We have to be able to, just like you did, bring that up and say, here's it. I have never actually been called a Pollyanna before, so thank you for that, because I'm usually a little bit more scared and a little bit more straightforward about just how difficult it is. But I also, but that's also why I believe that that I try to be positive when I talk to other people. There are times in the middle of the night, you could ask my dog, she's the only one up, when I'm in tears, right? This is really frightening hard work. But I've also been really heartened in these last 5 years with the amount of things that we can do if we do them together. I'm probably more scared about losing our democracy than our ability to solve climate change. We can solve climate change. We have all the technology, or most of it. We have most of the technology. We know how to do it. Where are the leaders? And that's why, again, I work for a nonprofit that doesn't endorse candidates. Something you guys can do in River Valley is get behind candidates, because some of those candidates running for some offices, many of whom we know are going to actually act on climate change. One of the people running from Congress wrote an op-ed 2 weeks ago. His solution to the war in Ukraine was to do the exact same thing we did in the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, the exact same thing, build more LNG terminals and more gas structures. So who's going to lead us out of that? And that's one thing I think you guys can be a part of, because we're going to be voting in larger pools, right? So that's just something to think about. But I do appreciate that sometimes in these conversations, they may not feel like we're moving as fast as we want to. I've also learned a lot personally that sometimes you have to go slow to go fast. We have to have these connections. We have to get together, talk about what we do that brings us joy, that is the work that we can offer, and then we really can make change. They're really, I feel more hopeful about climate change. Our ability to stay at 1.5 than I did 5 years ago, but the stakes are higher and we actually have to do it faster.
I feel like we're missing a really important part, which is soil, and that microbes in the soil are the biggest carbon. And if we're not talking about building soil, we're maybe missing the boat. And that all these other things that are technology based are really important.
Yep.
We can all build soil, and we can all make that happen in our yard, in our food choices, and everything. So I would just encourage us to talk about soil first.
Just talk about soil, compost, veggies, all the other stuff, and then return to veggies and compost and end with soil. I totally agree. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to put it on, but it's really true. And that's where I think like the Bitterroot Valley has a lot of cool things going. I mean, there's a lot of great local foods, and that I think the soil piece is really big. We can't solve it without we have to stop digging fossil fuels. So we can't just healthy soils. We have to do both, but soils are a big part of it. And my bad for leaving that one out of it.
One of the biggest users of fossil fuels is military.
Yeah.
And this war now, think of all the things that are burning all the people. And horrible. And all the countries in Europe now are building up more
I know.
military. We're doing more military. Military is, and military is the biggest user of fossil fuels. And I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like we are in these are really challenging times with figuring out the military pieces of this. And I do know that our military, right, it's like, 4% of our GDP, but a lot larger percent of our fossil fuel gases. But there's also some really exciting things that the military is trying to do. So we, again, can push them to do different and better if we have the right leadership. So that's a hard one. Soils is easier. and fertilizers also use a boatload of fossil fuels. So good soil, no fertilizers. We'll get to military next week. How's that? Peace, yes. Peace, love, and understanding will go a long way. Okay.
Okay, so we have reached our time, and so thank you, everyone. Maybe we'll see people in 2 weeks, and by all means, if you enjoyed enjoyed is maybe not the right word, but if you find this valuable, maybe we'll see you in 2 weeks. Tell your friends, share this online, just share anyway, and we continue doing whatever it is that we can do. Laura.
Can I make a short plug? I'm hosting an event on the 9th and 10th of April, Building a Stronger Bitterroot, moving from vision into action. That what ideas that we come up with in these kind of sessions, the event is going to be all about how you take your idea and put it into action. That we're not just talking anymore, but that we're a facilitated way to take the first step to make changes. So I have some information over there, and I invite everyone to participate. Thank you.
All right. So thank you so much, Amy. Thank you all for showing up, and everyone have a wonderful evening. Sleep well tonight.
Thanks, guys.